When you say coconut juice, I'm going to assume you're asking about coconut water, in which case, yeah, it can be very good for a lot of people. It's a great source of potassium, which functions as an electrolyte. It can potentially help with lowering elevated blood sugar. It can be healthy for the heart. And then you also have to think that sometimes it's going to be too much sugar for certain people, depending on what stage of health they're at. If they're dealing with candida or other sugar-sensitive conditions, then they might need to have it in a fermented form, in which you ferment it and it turns into coconut water kefir, and it's sour and fizzy instead of being sweet. And it's equally delightful once you kind of embrace that flavor. So that's a real treat to have fermented coconut water. Now, I'm not going to stop the censor there because I want to tell you guys a fun story about the original coconut cult, and I figured this was a good occasion to do it. So, the Sanskrit name for coconut is kalpavrishka, and this is translated as the tree which gives all that is necessary for living. Now, this is often misinterpreted to mean that one could live on coconuts alone, which certainly is not the case. There are many beneficial aspects to coconuts nutritionally, but you're not going to live on them exclusively. But this didn't stop a guy in the early 20th century. He was a young man living in Germany. His name was August Engelhardt. And he had this idea that he would build a utopian society of sun-worshipping people, and they would eat nothing but coconuts. It would be a purely coconut diet. And so this guy was born in 1875. So by the time he really got into things, it was getting into the early 1900s. And he had been a university student and then became a pharmacy assistant, and he wasn't really enjoying what he was doing. And he got into raw foods. He got into, kind of like a nature worship kind of a lifestyle, into sexual liberation and rejection of kind of mainstream living. So he wrote a book. And this book had various poems in it, including ones titled Mother Coconut, The Coconut Spirit, and How to Become a Coconut. And the idea of writing this book and these poems was that he was going to attract like-minded people, and they were going to join him in an escape to the South Pacific, where they would get an island, and it would be far from the reach of the restrictions of the places that they come from, and they could live their coconut-eating life there together. So Engelhardt had received a pretty substantial inheritance, and so he was able to pursue these dreams. So he bought 185 acres on a small island near Papua New Guinea, and this technically is in the Solomon Islands. And this was scarcely populated, and so he had carved out this section of it for himself. And he brought with him his library of 1,200 books, did not bring with him any clothing. This is, I guess, going to be a nudist adventure. And he began living in a simple hut, and he had a coconut plantation there that he purchased. So he was certain that eating coconuts all day and being in the sun was the secret of life. And so he started to kind of attract other people to come join him. And this was based on his idea of the brain being the most important organ, and the coconut as being something that would feed the brain, and the coconut being like the brain of the tree. It was like some pretty harebrained stuff. But so he thought, that this was it. And, just to clarify, coconuts, as I said, they're good for you. But, while they give a good amount of healthy carbohydrates and fat, they're lacking a lot of stuff. You're not getting vitamin A, vitamin K, B6, B12. You're not getting enough protein. You would have to eat a tremendous amount of coconuts to get enough protein. And then still, you're not going to be getting the right amino acid mix. You're going to be missing some amino acids. So this was destined for failure. But some other people started to come and join him. He wasn't the only one who thought this way. So he created this cult that was called the Order of the Sun, and he kept writing letters back to Europe and convinced about 15 people to come join him on this island. And he wrote to them and he said, don't fear malaria, because the warmth of the sun and the curative powers of the coconut will heal whatever ails you. And if anybody ever says this will heal whatever ails you, that's a good point to walk away and let them just do their thing and realize that's probably not the case. There were 2 people who came to join the island who were particularly noteworthy amongst the 15. So you have Heinrich Eukens. He's a 24-year-old vegetarian who thinks this is going to be the most amazing lifestyle ever on the island, just eating coconuts. And then you have Max Lutzlow, and he was a conductor, and he also played music in the orchestra in Berlin. So Eukens was just enamored with what they were going to do here, but his body didn't do well with it, and a couple weeks later he died. And then you have Lutzlow. He was doing a little better, but he loved playing music that Engelhardt hated, so they were always fighting. And after one big fight, Lutzlow actually ended up swimming out to a missionary ship that was docked offshore, and there was no fresh fruit on board there, so he refused to eat. And so eventually he came back to land, but he was really sick at that time and ended up dying shortly thereafter. Other people ended up dying from sunstroke, drowning, malaria. They were just dropping like flies, unfortunately. And because of course this lifestyle was not sustainable. And some ended up leaving the island, and eventually Engelhardt was left there alone. And he was just continuing this life. He was determined that this was the way to go. And believe it or not, one of the members of the group even died from a coconut falling from a tree and hitting them on the head. Those who didn't die left the island, they were over it, and they left Engelhardt there alone. He was still convinced that this was the way to go. He told others and told himself that the reasons that it hadn't worked for the others is that they had cheated on the coconut diet and eaten other foods and polluted their bodies. But he was not doing well either. There's photographs that are taken by tourists around that time who were visiting the island, and he was like absolute skin and bones, completely emaciated, covered in lesions. He was not thriving, to say the least. And eventually he got to such a low state of health that he was too weak to resist medical care or deny medical care anymore. So a doctor took him to Papua New Guinea and was able to nurse him back to health. And his decision after that was, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back to the island and give it another shot. And so he went back to the island, went back to the old program. And finally, he was taken in by a prisoner of war camp during World War I there at the time. But after a short while, they kicked him out because this guy was absolutely nuts. And so he carried on for a couple more years on the island when his body could no longer deal with that anymore, and he died at age 44. At the time, he was reported to have weighed less than 70 pounds when he was found on the beach. So that is a crazy and sad story of August Engelhardt and the coconut cult. And I guess the moral of the story here is moderation is a good way to go. Don't go to extremes. Mono diets, come on. And coconut is good for you, but it's not the only thing that you should be eating.